who were politically active. So a very, very interesting kind of shift in political. And here's another, so people have noisemakers, and what happened after the first protests was that it spread to other cities, it spread to rural areas, and this photograph, so this is in Olintepeque, which is a town in the department of Quetzaltenango. It's right near the entrance of Xela of Quetzaltenango. And the woman here on your right, Doña Choni, she never goes to protests. This is the mother of the other woman, who is my very dear friend. And she's, you know, her husband and her oldest daughter go to protests. She runs the family business. She goes to church. She's evangelical. She's very religious, not political at all. And the fact that she actually came out and went to the protest, to me, says something about how the movement is spreading, not only to incorporate indigenous people and to incorporate other demands. So the sign that Eunice here is holding is about the political prisoners. And so linking the issue of governmental corruption, the genocide trials, ecological issues, the people who have been jailed for their participation in the protest movements are all kind of getting linked. The only place where the protests have been weekly have been in Guatemala City. But there have been other protests, occasionally, sporadically, in other cities, in Huehuetenango, in Xela, and really throughout the country. And in fact, people in New York, I know, organized a series of Renuncia Ya protests in Union Square and elsewhere. When I was at the Latin American Studies Conference in Puerto Rico in May, the people who were kind of interested in Guatemala got together in the lobby of the Caribe Hilton and made a little, you know, hashtag that said Renuncia Ya, and took a photograph of themselves and posted on Facebook. If I had planned better, because it's the time of the afternoon on Saturday when there is going to be a protest in Guatemala City right now as we're here, so I should have made my little Renuncia Ya so we could have live streamed that. But it has become this, and so it's interesting, we can think about it interestingly in relationship also to Occupy, because it draws upon some of the visual and other vocabulary. So here's one of the, this has become one of the kind of recognized symbols that is used almost every week, and you just kind of fill in a different date. So, you know, 25 Abril, 6 Mayo, 13 Mayo, 20 Mayo, 27 Mayo, etc. Just, you know, adding the date and updating it. And so the protests have forced the resignation of the vice president. After she said she wasn't really responsible for anything, she actually resigned. And of course, the government said, the president said it had nothing to do with the protests. It was just an ethical, personal, moral decision. Interestingly, the United States has played this very ambivalent role. The US ambassador and the EU ministers have said, because the call has then been, okay, so we got the vice president. The ministro de Gobernación, who's the equivalent of the interior minister, also resigned. There have been several other government officials who've resigned, and of course, the president needs to resign, in the view of many people. This is not going to happen. The elections are in 2 months. He's got, you know, a few months after that. All the people that I spoke to, even the people who are organizing the protests, don't think that it's likely that he's going to resign. There have been moves to have his immunity removed so that he can face trial for some of the war crimes, for, you know, so that there's been this linking of the genocide of the 1980s. You know, I've seen people at some of the protests with T-shirts with the photograph of Jacobo Arbenz, who was the president who was deposed in 1954 in a coup. So there's been this linking of historical movements, historical moments, historical memories, issues, and themes from urban to rural. Where it's going to result, not really very sure. But it's just a very interesting, interesting moment. So the US ambassador has stood behind, and then he actually tried to come to one of the protests. And people just like got him out of there. They were really not very happy that he was there. And the United States has said that it might ask for Roxana Baldetti, the former vice president's extradition to the United States for some violations of laws. Again, I don't know that that's going to happen, but so the U.S. is still, playing an important role in Guatemalan politics. And so also there's been a certain amount of outcry about that, anti-Uncle Sam, anti the United States continuing to interfere in Guatemalan affairs. And then add to the mixture death by neoliberalism and ecological disaster, which was discovered in a rio called Rio La Pasión in El Petén, which, if you remember, that is the very sparsely populated area in the north of the country. And you can see here, there were discovered thousands and thousands and thousands of dead fish floating in the water. And there was some investigation as to the cause of this ecocide, and it had to do with the chemicals that were used in biofuel production. So much of the country, particularly the northern part of the country, the lowland areas, the northern part of the country and the northeastern part of the country, have been turned over to the cultivation of palma africana, of African palm, which is biofuel, which is not used in Guatemala. It's basically all for export. It's all transnationals as well as wealthy landowners. And, there's always been, all of the environmental impact statements that have been done for mining, for all of these are like, oh, no problem. There's not going to be any environmental, problem. We're going to safely dispose of the chemicals. But clearly, the fish tell a different story. And yes, so the fish tell one story, and then this is the same water that is used for crops, right, for people's agriculture. So this eco-crisis in the middle of the political crisis is just, as I said, a very, very interesting moment. This was from the protest on July 4th, the day that I got to Guatemala. There was a protest, so of course I went. And so it's very interesting that the adoption of the anonymous symbol and masks, they're for sale all over during the protest, lots and lots of people using it. Lots of kind of performative cultural techniques being used as part of the protest. There was one day when people went out and decided to just paint all over the cities, painted over all of the propaganda from the political parties, and then just painted, butterflies and trees and quotes from Frida Kahlo and quotes from Audre Lorde and Federico Garcia Lorca on the lampposts, on the signposts, on the curbs, on the places that normally would be sort of dirtied by political propaganda. So very interesting form of protest. And this is one of the people carrying an image of Arbenz, who was the president, one of the 2 or 3 democratically elected presidents during this brief period of the October Revolution from 1944 to 1954. So this linking of demands. So here are some of the key questions, which is, what does it tell us about capitalism? How do we think about social movements? And how do we think about the global proletariat? Okay. Just some more. This is a protest that took place the next week in front of Congress, and it was a week-long encampment that was held, organized mostly by a new formation called the Asamblea Social y Popular, the Popular and Social Assembly, which is mostly based in the rural areas and indigenous communities, that has also been trying to kind of put larger political questions about not just electoral reform, but also the whole system of development of mining. And this is a leader from the peasant group CUC, the Comité de Unidad Campesina, which is one of the groups that was very prominent in the 1960s and the 1970s, that was basically decapitated when the Spanish embassy was bombed in 1980, and many of the CUC leaders were in the Spanish embassy at that time for a protest. One of them was Rigoberta Menchu's father, Vicente Menchu, and so everybody who was inside the embassy, with the exception of 2 people, died in the bombing and in the fire. And the cook went underground, but it has reemerged. And integrated throughout many of these protests also are, you know, Maya spirituality and Maya ceremoniality. So at midnight, at one of the nights of the Plantation, there was this very lovely ceremony that was held right out in the street in front of the Congress. The police just sort of watched. They didn't involve it themselves or do anything about it. So this is an extremely brief synopsis of the last 497 years of Guatemalan history. And I'm clearly just going to skim over this. But I think it's important to think about history, because when I talk with my Maya friends in the United States and in Guatemala, the frame of reference is always this 500-year period, right? We have to look back to understand the present. We always have to go back at least to the time of the invasion, if not before. So this historical memory is something, that part of the historical memory, and how people reference chronology, what are the signposts, what are the moments, I think is very important. So this is one chronology. And we could look at a couple of different chronologies. A lot of people in the activist movements and the resistance movements today talk about the current incursions by the transnationals. I've kind of heard two different, one group of people say it's the fourth invasion, and some people say it's the fifth invasion. So it sort of depends on whether you, in terms of looking at the liberal revolution in the 19th century, whether you see that as being sort of separate events. But so it, you know, is invaded by the Spanish. There are wars trying to pit one Maya group against the other. They eventually decide that it's better to unite and fight against the Spanish than fight each other. And it becomes independent. It's not that economically important a colony for Spain. Certainly not as important economically as Cuba was, as a sugar colony. It really starts to become an export, and this is where I'm sort of looking at the narrative of extractivism, of extractive industries, of extractive agriculture start in the 19th century, when it's an independent country. Nominally an independent country, but already in the mid-19th century, you have a lot of foreign investment from the United States. You have German immigrants, Italian immigrants coming in, and together with the local elites, taking up a lot of the land. 1871 is a sort of liberal reform, and under Justino Rufino Barrios, not important to know all the Guatemalan presidents, so I can't see the slides there. So the first democratically elected governments are in the 1940s, and this process of the October Revolution of 1944, I'm really just going to mention that, but starts a process of opening up the franchise, labor reform, land reform. Arbenz, who was elected in 1950, takes office in 1951, only serves for 3 years. And so one of the big key players in Guatemala at this time, I mean, Guatemala has been important to the United States strategically since the Monroe Doctrine. Right, this is our hemisphere, this is our backyard, that expansionist moment of the United States as, you know, the Louisiana Purchase and as the westward movement, Central America comes into play, right? We launch expeditions to Nicaragua. You know, Guatemala becomes interesting for investment, and so United Fruit Company is the largest landholder in Guatemala by 1954, by the time of the coup against Jacobo Arbenz. So, and he is proposing a very modest land reform, right? So through all of these processes, there has been a continual displacement of indigenous communities, sometimes very directly through war, sometimes through legal means, because if you set up a court system and you control the language, Spanish, in which the documents are written, and you read it and you write it and you say that you need a deed to have land, and then you write the deeds and you control the courts. So people lost land through legal means because their system of land tenancy, their system of land ownership wasn't one that was based on papers and courthouses. And so land reform and also improving labor conditions were things that Arbenz did. Arbenz tried to reform the labor code, and United Fruit Company, you know, and its fruit plantations. United Fruit Company also thought that they knew how to preserve Guatemalan antiquities better than the Guatemalans. I went to see, and I'm sorry I didn't put up a slide of one of the Mayan temples, Zacaleo, outside of Huehuetenango, where you go to the site, and so many of the stone remains have been plastered over with concrete because United Fruit Company thought that it was more aesthetically pleasing. They unfortunately didn't get to the entire site, and there have been further excavations, so there are still some archaeological remains that have not been bettered. But just a little side example of what a United Fruit Company has done. And so two of the directors of United Fruit Company, two former directors of the United Fruit Company were Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles, who were respectively Secretary of State and the head of the CIA. And so they helped engineer, and it's been very, very well documented. There's a book called Bitter Fruit, which is one of the books that documents the involvement of the United States, and WikiLeaks cables have, you know, reaffirmed this. And this really set the stage for the next 30 years of military dictatorship, of military rule. It also helped decapitate the unions. There was a fairly strong trade union movement, unions who had organized in the plantations. Some urban workers, although urban workers then and now are mostly informal. The informal economy is extremely large in Guatemala and was large then. So the union movement really lost a tremendous amount of its leadership, were killed, were assassinated, people went underground, the unions were broken, and there hasn't really been a strong trade union movement in Guatemala since that time. There were, in the 1960s, as the movements that were important in starting what became the armed conflict or the Civil War were student organizing in the 1960s in the cities, and then peasant organizing. And so peasants, you know, marching on the Capitol, you know, demanding better prices for agricultural goods. So this kind of tension between the large plantations, the small farmers, and again, that, as I mentioned earlier, those peasant organizers. Guatemala, in many ways, was so the armed conflict, and again, I'm just highlighting a few things from the 1960s through 1996. So targeting first students in the cities, and then there were a series of massacres in the late 1970s. And what's interesting about these massacres, before the really huge, when we think about the genocide, we mostly think about it in the 1980s. And under the dictatorship of Rios Montt, of Mejia Victores, of the disappearance of, you know, 600 and some communities that were just basically obliterated from the map, communities that were wiped out entirely. But the first massacres took place over issues of land. In Panzos, which is a town in Alta Verapaz, there were a group of people who were upset about the way the municipal government was treating land ownership, land issues, and was allowing large landowners to make incursions onto small land holdings. And 200 people, you know, marched into the town square and wanted to talk to the mayor, and the army opened fire and killed one of the, an older woman, Maria Maquin, Mama Maquin, who was one of the first martyrs of the armed conflict. And in Rio Negro, which is another community in Alta Verapaz, which is in the sort of northeastern part of the country, also there were conflicts over US transnationals and mineral explorations. And if you, some maps that were revealed after the massacres at Rio Negro. Is there any way that we can ask people to be a little bit more quiet in the bar? Sorry, I'm just having trouble hearing myself. Were also conflicts over land and over development projects and dams that were being built. So there was a series of plans dating back to the 1960s and the 1970s to create these large hydroelectric projects in indigenous rural communities, supposedly for betterment, for progress. So at the same time that Guatemala was ruled by military dictators, they had also bought into this modernizing development narrative. And so part of this story is the story of fights over land, fights over resources, fights over models of development. Right, the narrative that development has to be highways, infrastructure, certain kind of projects, and if you oppose those, then you are anti-progress and also are really subject to be wiped out because you're holding the country back. And this has been part of the ambivalence, I think, that still underlies Guatemalan racism about indigenous communities. Yes? Sure.
You said both indigenous populations and oh, sorry, is that better?
I'll repeat the question.
Okay, you mentioned both indigenous populations and peasant populations. Are they identical? Do they overlap?
Okay. So that's a really good question about class identity, about ethnic identity. So, yes and no. Most indigenous people, and the majority of the indigenous population of Guatemala is Maya. There are two other groups, there's Xinca and Garifuna, who are also included as part of the indigenous population, but it's largely one of the 22 Maya ethnicities. Most of the indigenous population is rural, and most are subsistence farmers or peasants, however you would define that. People don't really make that clear a distinction between, but people who work on the land, who are cultivators. There are also poor non-indigenous rural people. So the poor rural population that works the land is not 100% indigenous, but there's a lot of overlap between that.
So amongst the indigenous population, how many languages?
You gotta let the microphone dip in.
Yeah.
You could just repeat the question.
Okay. So the question was, among the indigenous people, how many languages? 22? ¿Cuántas lenguas? Leo. Okay. So this is Leo, who is a Quiche friend of mine. We met in Guatemala, and he's now here in New York. So 22 languages, and we can talk more about, some of them are mutually intelligible, some of them are not. There are like 6 major language groups. A lot of people in Guatemala today still speak one of those languages as their first languages. So, but that question of how people identify, what is the label, the term Maya as a kind of umbrella for all of these 22 groups has really only come into use since the 1990s, since the ending of the conflict and a sort of resurgence of that identity. People identified as campesino, as natural, as indígena. They identified as the particular, as Quiche, as Mam, as Pocomam, as Quechí. But the kind of umbrella label of Maya has become only more prominent in the last 10 or 15 years. So the peace accords, and so I'm just gonna kind of swiftly go through to the present. So the peace accords signed in 1996. The first community consultations about mining, and I'll talk a little bit about the process of community consultations, were in 2005. The Canadian transnational starts mining operations also in 2005, although they actually got their license much earlier than that. And in 2011, Otto Perez Molina, who was a former head of the Caibiles, which are the special forces of the Guatemalan military, and he was a general and an officer in the region where the worst massacres took place, particularly the ones that came up in General Rios Mont's trial in the Xil region in Quiche, was elected. And he campaigned on a platform of, a hard hand against crime. That he was going to stop violence, he was going to stop crime, he was going to deal with organized crime, he was going to deal with the sort of social disorder. He basically, I think, terrified the urban middle-class population into voting for him, because people bought into this sense of insecurity and fear, and voted for him. And in rural areas, a combination of fear, Stockholm syndrome. You're better off with having the people who are your enemies ruling you, because if they're going to be more unhappy and worse for you if they're not in power. And also because the entire political spectrum really is dominated by the right wing. It was a choice of one right-wing party and another right-wing party. And the other candidate who ran in 2011, Manuel Baldisson, who was the runner-up, is a major landholder, major ties to drug trafficking, one of the wealthiest families. So it's really, not the lesser of two evils, and as well as just outright vote buying and corruption. So here's a photo of Pérez Molina, who used the nom de guerre of Tito Arias when he was in the military. And here in the presidency and campaigning, and that was the symbol of his party, was the clenched fist, hard hand. Yes.
What was shocking for me is that they elected Otto Pérez Molina in 2011. Like, they saw the example of El Salvador. We have had 3 mano duras in El Salvador, and it has only increased the murder rate every time they implement it. So then he came with that idea, and they voted for him. So for, like, Salvadorians, it was like, really? Like, didn't you see what happened to us? It screwed us up even more, and then you elect this person.
Well, one of the things that came out while I was in Guatemala, like maybe 3 or 4 days before I left, CICIG came out with another report. And it was a 126-page report, and it detailed the role of money in Guatemalan politics. And they have basically documented that there are a handful of families. So it's not just that people, like, naively, that there actually is a elite committee of the ruling class who decides who is going to be the president, and they decided that this round would be the military and that the next round would be, a different party, and that all the political parties, there are 28 political parties in Guatemala. It is completely, and they get 0.25% of the vote, and you think, why do these parties even exist? They exist because of the fractions and divisions among the Guatemalan elite, and people have particular reasons for funding, supporting, for running as a candidate to get some little, bit of money, some position, some post, something to make a name for themselves. I mean, the amount of money that's spent is insane, but it basically is, it confirmed our worst fears. You think I'm crazy, I'm a conspiracy theorist, I'm saying the ruling class basically determines who's going to be president, but in fact, it's true, and there are a handful of companies. One of them is one of the largest cement manufacturers. It's one of the places that has been in conflict in San Juan Zacatepeques over the cement plant, and the De Novella family, which runs the cement plant, has played a very outsized role in electoral politics in selecting presidents. And, so there's a whole other story about cement, which I probably won't get a chance to get to. Did you want to ask something else?
Oh, wait.
Okay. So I want to, Okay, so just to give a little bit of so I mentioned already, there is a very small landed elite that has controlled most of the country. There is a racial and class hierarchy, a very small section of the population that has no indigenous ancestry at all, that claims descent from the original Spanish colonizers, Albolongo. It's a very, very small, but most of the ruling families claim to have some ties to this very small group. And then there's a population that is either Ladino or mestizo, and these labels are clearly ones that are social and cultural, they're not phenotypical. You know, when do you stop being indigenous and become Ladino or mestizo? Is it because you stopped speaking the language because you thought you would get ahead, because your parents didn't teach it to you? You kind of try to whiten yourself a little bit through, as a form of social advancement. You don't wear traditional clothing any longer. So there are ways that people, you know, shift from one identity to another, as well as, you know, rape and voluntary intermarriage, other ways that people literally are mixed. And the majority, as I said, are indigenous. And exactly, you know, in any country where there are sharp and important and historically sedimented racial cleavages, you know, counting is a political game. Who counts? Who is indigenous? Who asks the question? What is the question that is asked? So census figures say 60%. You know, and when you go into areas like where Leo is from, La Ceiba, it's like 100%, right? 100%. Yeah, and so there are communities where, you know, everybody is indigenous, and then there are parts of the country where the population is more mixed. So to say 60% on a national level doesn't really tell you about the specificity of particular areas. And again, that map that I showed you, that map, you know, reads racially if you say you're from such and such a town or such and such a place, even if you're not wearing indigenous, you know, clothing, people will target you, will label you, in the same way that we do in the United States, based on kind of urban neighborhoods, you know, Flatbush versus Ditmas Park, right? Which part of the South Bronx you're from. And so these geographies of urban and rural, of the city and the country, of the capital and everywhere else, I think are also some ways of registering these social divisions. And so I'm not going to, you can find, and I'm happy to give you, if you want, the, you know, sort of United Nations Development Indexes. Most of the country is poor, and a lot of the rural population is extremely poor. In some of the rural areas, the indices of extreme poverty are run to 80%. But so the cleavage between this very wealthy elite and the life of everybody else is really quite extreme. And, you know, there's a tremendous amount of still everyday racism in Guatemala. Just recently, a friend of mine was walking across a street in Guatemala City, and somebody, you know, made a racial slur about indigenous women. There was a case in 2006 of an anthropologist who was a graduate student at the time at the University of Texas, Irma Alicia Nimatruch Velazquez, who was going out with a group of friends. They were involved in some international, you know, UN-sponsored research project, and they were all going to go out and have dinner at a nice restaurant in Guatemala City, and she wasn't allowed in because she was wearing traje típico. She was wearing a typical women's garment. This is 2006. She was turned away from the restaurant, and she won a legal suit, but still the sting, you know, is there, right? That doesn't erase the fact that this is still part of people's everyday lives. So I did actually mention this already, and just rural life. And so there's this tremendous ambivalence, as I mentioned earlier, about the indigenous population, which is the majority, and whether they are full human beings and whether they are actively able to participate in political life. When Rigoberta Menchú ran for president, she was the subject of a tremendous amount of very gendered, racist jokes. You know, why does she not wear patent leather shoes so nobody can see her iron balls? Was a joke that was being made in Guatemala City. The idea that an indigenous woman who would stand up in public, who would speak, who would be a public figure, had to somehow be less than female, and it was, you know, an insulting comment about why she would wear, you know, the skirts, the cortes, or yards of clothing wrapped around. So, you know, that's just one example of the kind of racial humor. So the Guatemalan Tourist Agency, INGUAT, uses Maya culture as part of what it sells, right? Guatemala, corazón del mundo Maya. Guatemala, heart of the Mayan world. And, you know, it's colorful, right? So, you know, indigenous people are great for adding color. And, you know, come see temples and girls wearing colorful clothing and people dressed up in costumes. So this kind of exoticized, folkloricized, here's another tourist, come see people doing tradition. And this is not to say people don't do traditional crafts and don't have festivals, and all of that stuff does go on. But this is, you know, being used to promote the country, and particularly indigenous women, I think, are often used to sell the country to tourism. At the same time, those women are made silent, invisible, and seen again as, because many women, more women than men, for all kinds of reasons, are less educated, higher indices of illiteracy, more likely to speak, to be monolingual speakers of an indigenous language, are seen also as a barrier. So they're both the symbol of the country, but also a barrier to progress. And yeah, this is, you know, being used to sell cell phones. So a woman sitting on a dirt floor weaving, but she has her Tigo cell phone taking a photograph that she's going to, you know, send via social media. There's a really wonderful book, which has unfortunately not been translated, by a woman who actually comes from, she's sort of a class trader who comes from one of the wealthiest families in the country, Marta Casaus Arzu. It's called Linaje y Racismo, Lineage and Racism, and she basically documents the predominance of the wealthiest elite families and within the Guatemalan elite, that racism, and she said, this is my translation, that ethno-racial prejudice is at the same time class prejudice. So class prejudice is expressed through this ethno-racial prejudice, and this has been part of the shaping of the national imaginary. And during the genocide trial, I'm going to stop soon so people can ask me questions, because I know I've been talking for a long time. One of the US reporters overheard some of the people who were not happy with the outcome of the verdict of the genocide trial and saying that the problem was that they didn't kill enough Indios, not that they killed too many. So this is 2014, a reporter heard this statement being said. So it's, you know, from the level of everyday microaggressions to much more overt statements. So as I mentioned, this has been a state that has been built up by powers that basically have not changed very much in the last 497 years. The formal structure of government has changed a little bit. There are elections, but basically the power structure is very much the power structure that was established under colonial rule. The mechanisms, the techniques, the technologies have changed. So the Spanish colony and then later the Guatemalan national elites had systems of debt peonage. There were forced labor regimes. There were forced labor regimes that obliged Mayan men to work on development projects until the 1970s. Right? 1970s, not 1870s, 1970s. 150 years after independence, there were still men who were just rounded up and you had to go work and build a highway, build a dam, dig a ditch. That was how the highways were built in Guatemala. That was how railroads were built. All of this, you know, national development, modernization projects were basically done through unfree labor. So you have this interesting, right, so to take this into the realm of Marxist theory, it's combined and uneven development. The existence of feudal, of capitalist, and of sort of small commodity and peasant production all coexisting at the same time. So I'm thinking about, you know, what is a mode of production? They're not mutually exclusive, they're not all encompassing. It doesn't mean that there's only one way of an economy functioning. Right? Guatemala, I think, is a great example. And so when I go work on that, in terms of my class identity, do I have a class identity when I work as a farmer on my own plot? When I work on someone else's plot for pay to make a little bit of extra money, And when I go work for nothing for the government because it makes me, am I a worker? Am I a peasant? Am I a slave? Am I a peon? Am I all of those things? Right? So I think it's just a very interesting question. The army also had forced labor because it made people, men particularly, do patrols. It made women make food for the army. The people who weren't killed were made to do a lot of work, to build bridges, to do a lot of construction, to do a lot of other things for the army, so that the idea of sort of, slavery and peonage are not something of the distant past in Guatemala. And so in the mid-19th century is when you start to get export-oriented agriculture. And the major crop is coffee. How many people here drink coffee? Okay, we all do, right. And probably some of us buy fair trade coffee from peasant cooperatives in Guatemala and Ethiopia and elsewhere. But this became one of the most important crops in Guatemala. I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about coffee. But throughout this period of the 19th century, you have these incursions onto peasant land. You have large plantations being set up. So coffee is the big one, and then there are also other crops like cardamom. Some of these are regionally specific. Releo is from coffee, is still very important. There's sugar cane, but Guatemala never became a major sugarcane producer. Cotton. And so the model that was set up, so within a period of about 25 years, coffee accounted for 80% of Guatemala's exports. And there was a process of expropriation of land, both church land and Maya land, in order to set up these plantations. And so plantation agriculture still exists in Guatemala today. There's often a permanent labor force, although smaller and smaller, of wage laborers, or sometimes people are paid with housing or with food or given little plots of land, so we don't have to pay you a wage, but you can grow your own food. And then temporary work from highland communities. And so this temporal labor migration is still a factor of life. I have friends who, when they were kids, the entire family would go for 6 months out of the year, would go down to the coast, pick cardamom, cut sugar cane, whatever it was, the crop was that they were hired for, and then go back and work their plot, go back in time for the corn harvest. So those two things, again, in the life of a family, in the life of a person, are interdependent. Wage labor, barely paid wage labor. Sometimes work in the plantations is debt peonage. People couldn't afford to own enough land to have subsistence crops, so they paid for their additional land by working for nothing for the landowner. The landowner would say, hey, I'll give you this crop of land, but you need to give me 3 months of work on the plantation. And so that's how people were able to be subsistence farmers. So there have been sort of a diversification of crops that cut in the permanent labor force. I mean, coffee is a whole sort of separate story. There's been a world market crisis in coffee, and then also in the last couple of years, a fungus that's attacked a lot of the crops. But coffee is still one of the important export crops in Guatemala. And people also, as I said, lost land through the armed conflict. Villages were wiped out. People had no place to go back to. When they came back, if they survived the war, they found that the local elites or the military had taken their farms and there wasn't really anything much that they could do. So land, scarcity of land, people's ability to have subsistence is clearly something that has been a long-standing project. And so I want to just, I guess, briefly touch on the issues of the projects, mining, hydroelectric, and other mega projects, particularly in the post-war period, and the ways in which these things are linked to flows of migration to the United States. So mining was an area that was kind of highlighted by the Guatemalan government right after the armed conflict. In 1997, the first kind of post-war president of Guatemala, under instructions from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund through their structural adjustment policies, privatized mining, took it out of the sort of national agenda and turned it over to possibility of foreign investments. So you've seen this real spike in foreign investment in Guatemala from the ending of the armed conflict. It's just shot up. And I have a graph, if I have time to get to, that kind of shows that spike. And they also rewrote the laws, so they cut by about 80% the amount of money that the government took from mining. So instead of having to pay 6% in royalties, the government only receives now 1% in royalties. The companies are allowed to be 100% foreign owned. So very little, the discourse of the mining companies is that they're doing this for the development of Guatemala. And one of the major mining companies, which is a Canadian transnational Gold Corp, which runs the Marlin mine, has a series of radio ads that are, you know, a Montana Exploradora de Guatemala, and you know, they have people talking about the school and the health clinic and all these wonderful things that mining has brought about. But really, and they talk about, they boast about the money that they give to, let's see, do we know which wire? No, okay, because Alana jiggled something before and it went back on. What's that? Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry, I have to go back.
It's just the time, the screensaver function.
Okay. Okay. And all these projects are supposed to be, there are hundreds of mining licenses, there are a couple of active mines. All of these are supposed to involve prior consultation, but the government hasn't done it, and there's been this very interesting process of community, and this is mapping some of the areas of land conflict and areas of conflict, areas of massacre. So the area in red is where most of the massacres took place during the war, and you can kind of see where there are conflicts over land on the other map. So there's been this grassroots response in many areas. People, because the government didn't set up a process of consultation, people have set up their own processes of consultation, which are called consultas comunitarias or consultas de buena fe. And it's this really interesting exercise, I think, in grassroots democracy. And anybody over the age of like 6 can vote. And so it is, some are done by raised hands, some are done by actual ballots. Here's a consulta comunitaria in one community done as a public popular assembly. Here's one that I witnessed where you can see the kids voting, and this is the ballot about whether or not you want mining and other projects in, this is San Carlos Sija, which is a town in Quetzaltenango. And overwhelmingly, the vote has been over 90% no. Now, clearly, maybe people who say yes don't go, don't show up, don't participate, but it's been fairly astounding. And it's also, again, this whole kind of process, a few of the points that I was hoping we could get to talk about are the issues of kind of autonomy, resistance, alternative structures. So you have this very centralized state tied into the military, to organized crime, to major money, to transnationals, and you have these other processes that are happening on the ground. At the same time, there's been repression of these resistance movements. This is one of the mines in San Miguel Ixtahuacan in San Marcos, the Marlin mine. And here you can see this is one of the pools where the gold is bathed in chemicals to purify it. there's been a tremendous amount of arsenic poisoning and other kinds of diseases, cancers, skin-related, skin diseases in this area. And then CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, is another factor. So, you know, mining, environmental contamination, people not having land, all of these are things that, I mean, there's not a sort of one-to-one tag between that and migration, but if you look at the Central America Free Trade Agreement, which was sold to the American public as something that was going to stem the tide of migration. This is from one of the Congress people who gave a speech the night before, or the night that CAFTA was voted, and saying, you know, want to fight the ever more violent MS-13 gang activity originating in El Salvador, want to begin to end the growing flow of illegal immigrants past CAFTA. And clearly, as we saw, the opposite has been the case. Immigration has increased in the years since CAFTA. And so, you know, free trade, what it has done, like NAFTA, it undermines subsistence farming. It has flooded Guatemala with exported agricultural goods, and small farmers can't compete with that. Mike, what?
You should try to, oh, admit it again.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. And so, you know, the growth rate, again, I can send you guys all the PowerPoint if you want. This is pretty much what I have. So I'm going to stop here. I mean, I could talk more clearly, and I'm trying to run through 497 years of history in a short period of time. But I'd rather stop and just take questions now and respond to them. And there are obviously people here who can answer some of them too. Some of the Guatemalans who are here may have better answers and more intelligent answers than I do.
We have a short dinner break for tonight. So today we only have a 1 hour gap between 5:30 and 6:30 with the evening.
Okay.
What is the population percentage of indigenous in general?
Oh, I said 60%?
60%. Okay.
60 more or less. And again, it depends on who counts, depends on how the question is asked. And there's obviously a big skew between different parts of the country. There are parts of the country that are 100% indigenous, or 90%. But the national average is around 60%. Yeah.
I have two questions, and they're not very related. One is a clarification on CAFTA. Who are the participating countries and who benefits most? And then, well, I guess I'll just ask this.
I'll take a couple of questions so that we can.
I guess I just wanted to further understand. I asked the same question earlier regarding extractivism and potential ways in which that was being combated.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So if we were to look at the bulwark that kind of holds up the ruling class, is it possible to identify one weakest link in all of that?
Okay, I'm going to take one more question over here, and then I'll try to.
I might have missed this in the beginning because I came a little late, but wanted to know if a little more information on the connections with militarism, because I've heard something of the police forces, the paramilitaries having connections with Israeli training in their military and police forces, so I wanted to know a little bit more about that.
Okay. Okay, so we have military, we have weakest link, extractivism, and CAFTA. So the Central American countries are part of. I don't know if it's expanded. I mean, it was Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, the United States. Mexico isn't covered because that was in NAFTA, and across the board, the countries have not benefited from it. Exactly who has, I would have to check and see if there's specific U.S. companies that have benefited. U.S. farmers have done pretty well. I mean, one of the things, because we subsidize corn very heavily, and those governments don't, I mean, that wasn't CAFTA, that was just there are not government supports for agricultural crops. And so with trade barriers being lifted, so one of the most disastrous effects has been on subsistence farming. And I have to look and see what the connection between biofuels, because a lot of that is also US capital, and whether that is in some ways directly related to CAFTA. But that has also been, the biofuel production has been disastrous for subsistence farming as well, because it takes arable land and it turns over to biofuel production. In some cases, people have been violently moved off their land. In other cases, nominally paid for their land, but not given adequate land in sort of exchange where they can set up and farm. So you have people who don't have enough, corn to eat. They can't eat the biofuel. And so, and they're not paid enough if they're going to work on the biofuel plantations. They're not paid enough to purchase the imported goods that they would then have to purchase in a market instead of growing their own. So that's also contributed to the migrant stream, because people just can't live on those wages. So the question about extractivism. So do you want to be a little bit more specific? Because
I was about to say, because you already covered the voting process and the privatization of mining earlier, and I forgot to specify it. I guess more specific, maybe. And you had mentioned that certain leaders earlier too, and environmentally oriented movements were being targeted. I guess I wanted to specify what particular organizational tactics were being used. Thank you.
So one of the, I think the important, the Consulta Comunitaria has been extremely important because it gathers people together. You bring about a sense of community. It is run by grassroots organizations. There's a lot of, so the Guatemalan central government doesn't accept this, but in fact local governments get very involved. So the teachers, the schools, all kinds of this infrastructure, they're usually held on Sundays, some are held on weekdays, but there's a tremendous, civic involvement of all levels of local community life. And then the consultation, in many cases, the anniversary of the consulta becomes a day that's celebrated in the community. September 18th is the 10th anniversary of the Consulta Comunitaria in such and such a community. So it carries a lot of moral weight. It doesn't necessarily carry legal or juridical weight, but it does become a kind of moral cachet. Some of the communities have directly organized against the mines. They have had road blockages, resistencias pacíficas, encampments. The longest running one in, that's called La Puya, which is in the province, in the Department of Guatemala, in the two towns of San Pedro Ayampuc and San Jose del Golfo, has been going on for 3 years. Constant 24-hour presence. They rotate, different people come in, different groups come in. It's close to the city. University students can come, international delegations can come. I mean, there's some reasons, and it has a very democratic, a very horizontal, they don't use that word, but a very horizontal leadership structure. They've involved the women in doing something other than making tortillas, which is in many of the encampments, what women end up doing is making tortillas and not so much participating in decision making. There's a very gender division of labor. But so La Puya has really, gotten support, and it has sustained itself, and they actually just won. So there's that tactic, disrupting activities, burning machinery, which sometimes ends you up in jail, ends you up being killed. So the variety of tactics that people have used, and some of the ones clearly that the leadership has not asked people to burn machinery, but people just get fucking pissed off. There's a bulldozer that's tearing up your road, and people just don't want to have that bulldozer there, and they just go out and, mess up the bulldozer. But in terms of the planned tactics, so community consultations, meetings, rallies, road blockages, marches, and then there's a whole set of legal avenues. The court system is very slow, it's very imperfect, but there have been it was a very important victory. In the case of La Puya, they got the Guatemalan Constitutional Court to say that the city government has to stop the operations of the mine. And of course, the mine is saying, the city's government, we can't do it, and the mine is saying, no, we don't like this ruling, but it's very important. They've also taken municipal authorities to court, brought cases, criminal cases against mayors of towns who have intimidated, repressed leaders. Also going through the international process, there is the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Again, a very slow process, takes years. So there are a number of different ways that people have tried to address, and there's one community that has set up its own hydroelectric, like community-based, community-supported hydroelectrics. I didn't get to see it, but they're trying to be self-sufficient. And so they're saying, well, we're not against having energy, but we want to control it. We need energy. We need electricity. We like having televisions. We like being able to charge our cell phones. You know, we like having a radio, but we want light in our house. But we don't want this under, is there a way of doing it? Is there a model of development that is not in the hands of the transnationals? That's one community. So, you know, to me there's just the very interesting questions that are being, and I think in some fundamental ways the questions are being raised about who owns the territory and making collective claims on land. Because people are not just saying this is my private property, this is my house, but you know, this is our community as Canjobal people, this is our community as Chuj people, this is our territory as indigenous people, and we are the ones who determine what happens here. Weakest link? I don't know, do you guys have an opinion?
What was the question?
What is the weakest link in, if you were going to think about how you would, like how would you topple the state in Guatemala?
If you think of like all the components that hold up the ruling class in this situation, like the bulwark, if you had to identify one piece of it, what's the weakest point that if you had to launch an attack, that would be it. Like there's the military, there's the church, there's these different components. Is there one weakest link there?
Do you have a thought?
Well, I think I do. I think the weakest link will be, if I get the question right, the overthrown, the coup that was held in the overthrow of Arbenz Guzman, because at the time there was the Cold War going on, and there was a lot of tension of the communism taking over the backyard of the U.S. And I think that's the weakest part of the history.
Now she was asking if you were going to, if you were going to try to make a big political change in Guatemala, like what would be the target? ¿Cuál sería el blanco ahora? ¿Cuál es la parte de la cadena ahora que es más débil? Sí, sí, sí.
Para hacer el cambio.
Sí.
Is there a contradiction, let's say, within the ruling class even that could be identified?
Well, I think there is definitely contradictions, and the problem now in Guatemala is that the ruling class or the right-wing side is completely opposed to the ideas of the left side, and vice versa. So there's nothing, there's no center, there's nothing that's saying, let's talk about this, let's put it on the table, and let's come with a solution for everybody. It's just we're in the case of indigenous people and groups that are advocating for, you know, the indigenous peace and community for the poor. They're also, this is my point of view, they're also just rejecting anything that's coming from the right wing. And I think that's the biggest issue and might be the answer of the question you're asking. I think if a leader comes and brings all these issues to the table now, I think everybody's going to go for him, because right now we don't have anybody standing ahead of the movement or trying to do this. Right. That.
Yeah. So the political crisis is very interesting. So the left, sadly, and I think it's an interesting comparison with El Salvador, because the FMLN was able to turn itself into a very viable political party and won the presidency. Right? Regardless of what we think about, Funes, but they turned themselves into an electoral force. The Guatemalan guerrilla movement was not able to make that same leap successfully. The URNG, which was the unified group of the 4 guerrilla organizations that negotiated the peace accords, did become a political party. The largest percentage of the vote that they won was 12%. That was in 1990. When Colom ran under the URNG, and then he ran again. So the same person. Also, politicians switch parties. They're very fickle. They're promiscuous. So the person who was the next to last president, the president before Perez Molina, Alvaro Colom, ran under one party. He ran as the candidate of the URNG, the guerrilla front group, and got 12%. And then he switched parties and he won. So, it's not quite so simple. And the percentage of the vote that the left has gotten has declined. In 2011, I think the combined vote of the left was something like 4% or 7%. I think Rigoberta Menchú from WINAC got something like 3.28% of the vote. And she's the best known indigenous person in all of Central America, in Guatemala, but is a controversial figure in many ways. And the projections of what's going to happen in 2015 for the left is not a whole lot better. And a lot of people are basically saying, we don't want any of the political parties. We don't want the left political parties. We don't want the right political parties. You're all a bunch of, corrupt, en estas condiciones no queremos elecciones. Under these conditions, we don't want elections. Now, that is not going to happen. The elections are not going to be postponed. Because of the way the election laws are set in Guatemala, you sign up for you're registered for a particular date. And if they change the date, then all the candidates would have to go through the entire process of re-registering themselves. So there is just a dissatisfaction with the political structure. And so I don't know what that is going to mean. The person who is the front runner, Manuel Baldizon, his vice presidential candidate, has gotten kicked out. And he can't run as a president without a vice presidential candidate. And there's no time for him to select another one. So it's just, there's a political game with the Elections Commission about trying to get candidacies reinstated. Many, many candidates have actually just gotten, across the board, have gotten knocked off. The daughter of the former dictator, Rios Montt, Suri Rios, who was running as a presidential candidate, her candidacy was thrown out. That doesn't stop the election mechanism. She still has billboards, she still has radio spots. There's this kind of perpetual political machinery that functions. Extractivism. I don't know if there's still something more that you wanted to know about these, and so have they been successful? I mean, I think that there's a pretty widespread sentiment across the country about that these things don't bring about positive economic benefits, that they don't bring about development, that they don't bring about jobs, that the number of jobs that the mines create is very limited, that the health effects are very serious, that all of the expert studies and all of the environmental impact statements that have been done are very flawed. Most of them are paid for by the companies. And so that whole process of review is a very flawed process of review. the crisis, of the government, which is does the state have any legitimacy, I think is a pretty serious one. I don't know that anybody really knows. So beyond that, there's going to be an election and someone's going to get elected, but the protest movement will continue after the elections, and what is the outcome going to be? I don't know that anybody really knows. Yeah, sure.
So sorry I wasn't able to be here at the beginning. How is the relation with Belize? Because Belize, as we know, is right in the middle of Guatemala and Mexico. So I wanted to ask you if you had a chance to connect with the Belize workers as well.
That's an area that I don't know that much about, but there have been, partly through the agency of some of the human rights groups that have been working in Guatemala and also Belize, so groups like Cultural Survival, Sobrevivencia Cultural, has brought together indigenous leaders. I mean, a lot of people don't have the funds to travel, even though Belize isn't that far. And so there have been some international human rights groups that have helped bring together, because they are facing some of the same issues. So there's shell oil in Belize. It's more oil, that's the form of extractivism, less mining, but it has been the same sort of model of foreign transnationals, different political history, different structure, different kind of ethnic, racial composition in Belize, but there have been at least some dialogues. And there also have been some dialogues between indigenous groups in Guatemala and in Mexico. If you noticed on that map, the border's really close, and Chiapas used to be part of Guatemala. People still consider it, that it was part of Guatemala historically. The boundaries of the nation states are relatively recent. And so there have been some regional summits on issues of water, for example. And so I think that the possibilities for looking at these in a regional context, regional dialogue about this. It seems to, be from the indigenous leaders whom I know, that people are very often going to, conferences or meeting people in the neighboring countries. Michael, yeah.
Hi, Lisa. The theme, this intensive has the title 21st Century Class Struggles. And then one of the longer titles was actually Existing Capitalism and the Generalized Proletariat. And when putting this talk together, you and I had a discussion, and you spoke particularly about a paragraph in our description where we were in our description of a generalized proletariat in the world, that the peasantry was beginning to come to an end, and you objected, and at a number of levels, and not just in Guatemala, but you said that you would speak particularly to this, and I know this is a big question, but could you make a few comments on this?
Sure. Well, I think I hinted earlier that I think the question of of class identity is a fluid one. And class may not be the only way that people define their identity and their relationship to So I'd say, for one, yes, Guatemala has been part of the capitalist world system for a very long time. People's lives as peasants have been shaped by capitalism for 500 years. And so we're defining the proletariat only as being wage work, which is a small part of the Guatemalan workforce. I mean, there is some wage work on plantations. There is some work in the state sector. There are some state unions now. There are not really any other unions. There have been some maquiladoras. I mean, there's some, other development projects. But by and large, the informal sector, which is, street vendors and all kinds of temporary agricultural work, still accounts for the majority of how most Guatemalans earn their living. And the land is very important, not just as a means of earning a living, but a sense of identity tied to the land. So land-based identity is still extremely important. Clearly, you know, you could say, well, we were discussing yesterday, so what is the surplus army? Well, it's very large, right? Because it's most of the peasants. Well, it's not the industrial reserve or the surplus, you know, labor. And since so many people in Guatemala either earn a living through the informal sector, which is like, of the wage earning population, it's something like 60 or 80% of it is informal. So that doesn't mean that people don't have a sense of exploitation, oppression, that neoliberalism is bad, that capitalism doesn't offer solutions. Whether that is in fact, though, a sense of, people would define that as a class consciousness, I don't know. But certainly there is an anti-capitalist consciousness. So can we think about forms of organizing that are not articulated as class? Which is why I went back to that quote from Marta Elena Casaus about sort of the ethno-racial divide. I think what she's trying to say, or my interpretation, is that's the shape that class division is articulated or lived or understood in Guatemala. It doesn't mean that, you know, we shouldn't think about. So when you ask the question about the working class, I said, well, what working, you know, is it the working class of street vendors on La Sexta Avenida in Guatemala City? Is it the women in the sex trade? Is it the people who work as temporary wage laborers in agriculture who then go back and work on their farms? Is it the labor force? I mean, 10% of the Guatemalan population is in the United States, right? So in part of, you know, so the surplus army of labor of Guatemala has been moved to become the low-wage workforce here, right? So we have this way in which I think, and this is not just an issue for Guatemala, but it's an issue for all the, except for where we can say it's specifically refugees, right? Syria or, you know, other places. But when we look at these large migrant streams, is that some way in which governments promote this, or at least condone it, because it's a way for they're dealing with their unemployment issue. Is that the mic? I don't know. So,
is that green or red?
It's green. It's not the mic. I don't know, is it the, I don't know, Michael, does that satisfy? I know that I didn't say everything that you wanted me to, but it's just. I dropped a big bomb at the end of your presentation. Well, I was trying, you know, it took a longer time to give the context than I had originally planned. That was very good. We should wrap it up. Yeah, so this is just, I'll just quickly, this is the foreign direct investment. This is kind of graphed against the years of CAFTA, so you can see this huge spike of foreign direct investment in Guatemala. And remittances, which is another part of the economy, very important as a result of migration. So you have 10% of the population out, and then you have remittances, which basically is, the graph looks almost identical to the one for foreign direct investment. So you have these sources of income from outside the country. And so what does that do? That doesn't improve, it doesn't eradicate poverty, but it takes the government off the hook. It's a neoliberal solution. It privatizes. How do you deal with issues like healthcare, with education, with housing? Well, you don't do anything about it. You have your population who migrates. They send money back, and what do people use those remittances? To build houses, to buy medicine, to send their children to a better school, to buy school supplies. I mean, that's where the remittance dollars go in. So they go back into the national economy, but they basically go into the places where the social welfare system, where the social safety net, where public spending has been cut. Oh, and people build their own roads. I mean, the government is supposed to build highways, but you see all over Guatemala people stopping for there's no road repairs. And so if you drive through rural areas, you'll get stopped by a bunch of kids holding a jump rope across the highway asking you for a contribution to do repairs. So this is, you know, this has been a very successful, in many ways, people talk about Guatemala as a failed state or as a weak state, but in some ways the state functions really well for the purposes that it was established, right? Which is for the extraction of wealth for the ruling class and for support, for the foreign investors. And it functions great for those guys. So I would say it's not a failed state in that sense. I know we're losing people and we're tired, and I probably, haven't answered everything that people wanted. I'm going to stop. If people have questions you want to ask me privately, I'm happy to do that. Fred Murphy and I are going to be doing a class in the fall on Monday nights on extractivism and indigenous rights. It's not going to be only about Guatemala. We're going to be looking at this whole issue of extractivism as one form of neoliberal economic policies. So we would invite you to join us for that. I don't know what exactly the starting date of the fall semester is, but it'll be early September. Late September.
It'll be mid to late September, and we'll go until early December.
Okay. So,
10 weeks, your choice.
yeah. And thank you.
Thank you.
Do I turn this off?